implementing research and practical applications to improve honeybee health. Thanks a lot, and why don't we give Dr. Royce a warm welcome.
So I need the technician to deal with that.
You want me to?
So there's a tremendous amount of things to talk about when we talk about basic queen rearing, and we may run out of time tonight, so if I start to go over too long, but I do have a clock up there in front of me. It's hard to shut up an old professor, you know. I'm sure you've heard that before. So what I want to do tonight is talk about the queen cycle, stock selection, and then we can get into queen rearing techniques, cell builders, because if you pass up one technique, that the other two that I know about for queen rearing will require a place to put the cells to grow them up. And then what do you do with the queen cells after you have them ready to move to something? Mating nukes is usually what happens. And then what do you do with a mated queen? So these are the things I'm going to try and cover tonight. We'll see how far we get. I welcome questions that interrupt me, and if we go down a different road, that's okay too. And I also need to say that these pictures, we did this presentation yesterday, and we haven't had time to give the proper credits, so thank you to all the people who let me steal their photos offline. Some of them are ours, and some of them are not, but anyway, so. And I'm not sitting in front of the computer yet, so the queen cycle, and why is that important? So all of you know that it takes a worker about 21 days to develop, and so what's the difference with the queen? We see a queen cell here at the bottom, and it hasn't been capped yet. It looks really healthy. It looks like a healthy colony, and that cell will probably be capped in another day or two. The difference between a queen and the larvae of the worker is that the workers are fed as long as the cell is uncapped, and then once they cap it, the larvae is done feeding practically and will develop immediately into the pupae. Whereas the queen cell, the larvae is still feeding when they cap it. They don't feed her themselves. They fill the bottom of that cell with royal jelly. And once they have filled it to capacity and they know how much they want to put in there, they cap it. And the larvae continues to feed on that for a number of days before she actually pupates. So here's the life cycle of a honeybee, and it's the same for male, female, queen. The difference is the time. So if this were a worker, the egg is 3 days. The larvae is about 5 days. So you're now at 8 days. And then I've got to subtract 8 from 21, which I can never do. Is the pupal stage, and the adult emerges after that. So what happens between the egg hatching and the larvae standing upright in the cell like that? Most of the larvae you would see are curled in the bottom of the cell. They kind of form a little C right in the bottom, and the worker bees bring food to them and deposit it there. When they are ready to pupate, when they're ready to change from a little grub into the pupa, the first thing they do is they quit eating, they're done eating, and they stand up in the cell upright. So if you see larvae that have their little nose poking out almost out of the cell, they're about ready to pupate. The worker bees recognize that they don't have to feed them anymore, they cap the cell, and the larvae pupate, and then, what is it? It's about 12, 13 days later they emerge as an adult bee. So that's a worker. The queen goes through this a lot faster. And it always amazed me when we had half-decent springs, but you always get showers in the spring, so you can have bad weather, bad weather, bad weather, and then you have a few hours of sunshine before it really breaks off and gets nice. And that's when the bees swarm, because during all this bad weather, these queens have been growing up, and then a virgin hatches out, and she's like, well, as soon as it's nice, we're going to swarm. And that's what happens. So you don't always catch those swarms. But I like to tell beekeepers that if your colonies swarm, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, because you're being a good beekeeper if that colony is strong enough to swarm and healthy enough to make virgin queens and send the old queen out with a swarm. You're doing the right stuff. So it takes a queen about 16 days. And I'm going to guess she pupates at about day 7 through this whole cycle. And then she's a pupa 16, 17, 18, 19 days, and then she emerges. I could be a little off there, but we'll have a better picture of this so we can go on. This is just another picture of the worker life cycle and what they do. The queen has to lay an egg, and you see her laying an egg there. And this is something that might help you as a grafter if you decide to graft your queens, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I just want to point out that you can age the eggs as you look into the cells. So first you have to get so you see the eggs when you're looking. And I always try to have a nice sunshiny day, because that makes it a lot easier. And if the sun is behind me, it will shine into the cells down to the bottom of it so you can see eggs. So when the queen first lays the egg, it stands perfectly upright. And as it ages, it begins to fall over. So by day 2, it's kind of over here. And by day 3, it's almost laying down in the cell, but it's still an egg. And then it hatches into the larvae, and the larvae is lying down in the bottom of the cell. So you can see freshly laid eggs because they're perfectly upright, and as they age a little bit, they fall over a little bit. So you can kind of tell, is that one about to become a larvae or not? Which could be important depending on how you're keeping track of young larvae, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So here's the cycle we just talked about. And what did I say? Day 7. See, I was way off. I tell lies a lot, and this is why I need all these pictures. So they cap the cell back at day 8, and she is a pre-pupae at that time. And I'm not sure from this picture. It looks like she may be starting to pupate about day 10, so I was 3 days off. But it is very quick relative to the 21 days of the worker. And I don't know if you all know it, but varroa mites prefer drones. And the reason may be because drones have a much larger life cycle than either of the 2 female casts in the system. So it takes a drone about 24 days to emerge as an adult from the egg. They're also much larger, so more mites can fit in the cell, as it were. Can I get the next one? Okay. So you have queen cells, and in the spring you almost always see the queen cells on the bottom of the frame or on the bottom of the comb. And we call those swarm cells. And I've heard people say, experienced beekeepers even say, well, if they're anywhere else on the comb, they're probably a supersedure cell or an emergency cell. There's a difference. And I'm like, well, yes, but if it's spring and they want to swarm, they'll put those cells wherever they can hide them because they don't want you to find them and take them out. If you're a queen rearer and you're setting up mating nukes and cell builders, the last thing you want is to miss a swarm cell or any queen cell that's in that hive, because if a virgin emerges before you are ready to take those queen cells out, she will happily go along and start to kill them all. These are several different stages, and before I move on to that next slide, I just want to point out that's probably a queen cup. The queen will lay eggs in that most commonly, but sometimes workers will move eggs and young larvae. They can do that without hurting them, whereas if we try to move eggs, we often damage them. And there's an open queen cell there, but they've probably finished filling it with royal jelly. And then I can't tell if that one's capped or not, but that is also common of swarm cells. They're all different ages. And they build lots of them. It's pretty amazing. So this is what happens when a virgin gets loose in your cell builder, and or in your finisher, depends. So there's a capped cell. What happens is the virgin queen, the first virgin queen to emerge, will sting the queen inside the cell, and then the workers come back and they chew it out on the side and clean out the dead queen body. So when you see these cells chewed out on the side, that indicates that you've had a virgin queen loose in your cell builder finisher units. If you see them chewing that cell up from the bottom, it's been my experience that you've got a disease problem. And I think one of the most disappointing things to me is when I've had a really good take on the grafts I've made. So it's a little bit challenging, and anything you damage slightly, the worker bees will throw it away. So you graft, I don't know, whatever there are on here, 15 cells or 20 cells on the bar, and you give it to your cell builder colony, and they will accept or discard your work. And when you get 95 to 100%, that's what you're aiming for. And so when you come back and check, I usually check twice. I don't know what other people do in the business who raise thousands of queens, because I only raise 200 or 300 at a time, not even that many. Anyway, so when I put them, when I do the first check, it's 1 or 2 days after I have grafted, and I'm checking to see how many whether I've been successful or not. It's really disappointing when you only have 1 or 2 accepted, but it's exciting when you have 90 to 100%. So here you are, and you pull them out, and you have 90% or 100%, and you put them back. They are capable of throwing them out later. So I always come back a day or 2 before I make my mating nukes, if I don't have mating nukes already made. And I count the cells that are left, so I know exactly how many mating nukes have to be ready on day 10. Now, there's a reason why we wait very carefully until day 10. And so when I check those cells, I do it really gently, and I take them out, and I don't turn them, and I don't shake them, and I count them again. And sometimes there'll be 1 or 2 more that they have discarded. So as I went through several years, probably the first 3, learning all these different things because I hadn't done it for years. As a graduate student, I learned to graft, and I learned to look at these things. But you know, when suddenly you're out there and this is going to be your business, it's a whole different ball game. Partly because you've spent a lot of money, as Tim mentioned, so you've got to buy some kind of equipment to make mating nukes out of. The grafting tool is not cheap, and there's a lot of different kinds. We'll talk about that. You've got to figure out whether you're going to make wax cups or buy plastic cups. There's a lot of different stuff that you need to have. Anyway, so if they chew that cell down and I've come back, and this happened more with Italian queens than it did with my Russian crosses that I was using at the time. I would come back and it was usually June. It didn't usually happen early in the spring, but in June I would come back on day 7 or day 8 to check and see how many mating nukes I was going to need. And they would be chewing those cells down from the bottom, which told me it was not a loose virgin, probably, unless she was really in an old cell and maybe that was happening. But it struck me that it was more like some kind of viral disease, and it was like somebody held a candle under these cells and they just melted up. Anyway, those are things that happen to you. Here's a queen that's emerging, and you'll notice that when she's emerged, there's a little flap left there. So if I suspect that I've had a swarm leave my hive and that they may be queenless, I look for cells in there to see if I have any cells that are left intact after the swarm left, and you can tell if they've been chewed out by the worker bees for whatever reason, if that flap is gone and the cell is broken up at all. But if there is a flap there, I know a virgin has emerged in that colony. So the colony, if they have a cell like this, is probably queen right with a virgin. And so I just want to close it up carefully and go away and come back probably 6 or 8 days later to see if that queen is now laying eggs, to see if the virgin has gotten mated. If you come back too soon, colonies that are queenless or have a virgin tend to be really nervous. The worker bees are very, very nervous. And after a first year or so, I realized I need to know when I put a cell in this nuke, and I used regular nukes. So I would write in pencil on the lid whenever I put a queen cell in. And so I have these notes, and then they went back 3 or 4 years, unless the lid needed painting. So I could remember, oh yeah, I need to wait to look at this, because if I look too early, they will ball the queen. Does anybody know what that means? Just a couple of you. So if the bees are really nervous, and you open that colony and start banging through the frames, they will find that virgin, or even if she's a young queen, she's been mated, but she's 1 or 2 days from having developed eggs, they will just form a worker ball around her, and the workers will start to sting her. So you don't want to bother them until she's laying, and then they seem to calm down. They know they have a laying queen and they're happy again. So I spent a lot of time looking for little flaps. Okay. Stock selection. This is something, if you start working with rearing queens, you're going to need more than one of you, because I ended up trying to do it basically on my own. I'd start to train a helper and they'd say, this is too much work, and they'd go away, and there I'd be, another season working by myself. And so I never could keep really good notes because it always took too long. So I did a lot of writing on the lids, and the pencils often got lost in the grass. And so I always carried 2 or 3. And I worked barehanded. And I highly recommend that if you're going to raise queens, you learn to work barehanded, because you're going to want to catch those little beauties and do things with them. So I learned to work barehanded. I'm an entomologist, so I handled insects for years, and it never bothers me to pick things up. And I learned to pick up worker bees even without getting stung. And so I always work barehanded. Fortunately for me, if I get stung on the finger, that finger will get tight, and then it will, after a while, it's not bad anymore. So my fingers are not very susceptible to swelling, and so I use my bare hands a lot, and they get covered with propolis, but I manage to keep track of the bees and write with a pencil and catch queens. And if I'm really covered with propolis, I wipe them off as best I can when I'm chasing a queen, because I don't want her to stick to my fingers. Anyway, so keeping track of queens for selection, and these are recommendations by Sue Kobe. She does 4 score sheets for every queen. She does these score sheets for the queen mother, and I don't know if she does them for the drone mothers, but I would say if you're really trying to select for particular traits, whether it be surviving in the cold Pacific Northwest, or whether it be tracheomites, or varroa mites, or a combination of things, you've got to have these score sheets, and you want them for the drone mothers, the queen that's going to supply the grafting material, and then the daughters, if you can, follow them that long. So this was the first sheet she did, and it's called a pre-score sheet, a pre-selection score sheet. So you go through and you look at the colony that you pick out a colony you think is really good, and you check for brood viability, temperament, build-up, pollen, disease, and you might write some comments on your score sheet. Generally, they give each character, each criteria, a number from 1 to 5, with 1 being poor and 5 being excellent. Okay, so, and each character is treated the same way. So if they get a score of 5, it's a good queen, and if they get a score of 1, that they're not good for that one trait, and then they total out, you get a total score. So you're basing your queen on all these traits, not just on 1 or 2 traits. And you're able to keep track of this, so you will know when you come back to her daughters whether or not you're getting the traits that you're looking for. So this is the pre-score sheet. You do it twice a year, and this is a lot of work. This will take time, and this is where it helps to have helpers. So, you're not trying to do everything, keep track of everything. You'll notice on the next sheet we have a score for hygienic behavior. And this is Marla Spivak's work. She spent about 20 years working on the hygienic behavior, and it's excellent. But it is a recessive trait. So when she would send her breeder queens out to, say, Pat Hytham in California, he would graft from those breeder queens, and then the virgins he got would be open-mated in the northern part of the Central Valley of California. Okay, so they're open-mated with whatever drones are out there. Harder to keep track of drones, especially in California. You can try to isolate your mating yards, but there's a lot of bees in California, and not all of them are going to have their drones mothers. They're not going to even know they're drone mothers. They just send their drones out to mate, because that's what bees do. So if this is a recessive trait, so if they mate with fathers who do not have the recessive gene, even though the mother does, the workers will not show this trait. And so most of the commercial people didn't really like this trait because they couldn't keep it. They're not queen breeders. They can't hang on to it. And so if their colonies swarm and requeen themselves, they've lost the trait. You do this with liquid nitrogen, and you you find a welding store that will sell you what they call it a dewar. It's actually called a semen dewar because we use it to freeze cow, pig, sheep semen for artificial insemination in the mammal world. So it's called a semen dewar, but you can just say dewar and then you don't have to be embarrassed by saying semen. And you pour out of this thing, and it may hold 5 liters or 10 liters depending on where you get it and what kind of tanks they have for these various things. It stands yay high or yay high. And you can pick it up and pour the liquid nitrogen out. Liquid nitrogen is about minus 90. So if you spill it on you, that's bad. It may cause a slight burn. But what I discovered was that if I wore gloves, leather gloves, and I spilled it on the leather glove, the leather held the cold against my skin. If I just spilled the liquid nitrogen on my skin, it was gone like that because it's minus 90 to whatever my skin temperature is a big difference, and so it would evaporate before it had time to burn me. So I worked with the liquid nitrogen without gloves, which is pretty normal for me. I don't work with gloves anyway. And you pour it into a styrofoam cup because those won't go brittle and break on you, and you put a PVC pipe that's 3 inches in diameter into a solid bit of brood, and you want the brood to be pretty solid around the edge. So if you look at that picture, that's not too bad. A little close to the top, and there's some open brood pretty close to the edge of that. But if you can keep the solid ring of cap brood around your PVC pipe when you squish it in, then you will get a good seal. But if there's any open brood or open cells that come into that where you're pushing the tube in, then the liquid nitrogen tends to leak out underneath there, and you don't get as good a freeze job. And you take the styrofoam cup and you pour 12 ounces in it, so you make a mark on the inside of that cup, and you pour the liquid nitrogen in and then dump a little bit in to seal it, and then you dump the rest in when that evaporates, and you will freeze probably the brood on both sides of that. You put a thumbtack in the top so you can find that frame again. If you have highly hygienic bees, they will clean that all out and have eggs laid back in it before you get back in 72 hours. 48 hours is 2 days. We used to do a 2-day test. And then Marla said, let's push it up to a 24-hour test. So you're looking for 90% or more of all the cap brood taken out, all those bees that were killed by the nitrogen taken out of the cap brood. And I think you have about 63 cells in that 3-inch diameter space. This one would have failed because there's quite a few cap individuals left in there. And you have to count the uncapped but still have a piece of bee in there as if it were capped. So it's a pretty rigorous test, and when you first start doing this, you won't have 90% successes, and you do it twice, and both times you do it, they have to have a high rate of removal. If they don't, then they fail. But when you first start out, if you say get 2 tests that are 85% instead of 90%, and that's your highest, that would be what you would select for your queen mother. So she's going to provide the larvae. And then you would look for some drone mothers with that same percentage and try and isolate them or do instrumental insemination. There's a difference and I have to say this, I took the class from Sue Colby when she was still in Ohio. And I learned to do instrumental insemination, and you go, well, why is it so important to why can't we just freeze this drone semen like we do with cattle or pig or sheep? And the reason is because a lot of those cells are killed by the freezing process, a lot. But in a mammal that you want to have one calf or two calves or two baby sheep, usually we don't want twins in cows, but you don't need all those cells that you have extracted from the bull to be viable, because it only takes one semen to inseminate that calf. And then if you're going to impregnate that cow again next year, you come up with a fresh sample of semen, obviously. But with a honeybee, you are giving her semen that's going to last for 3 years, maybe 4 years, and some of them might even go into their 5th year. So you need, and they use that semen for the whole time. You can't come back and re-inseminate them. So if most of those semen are dead, it's not going to work. I might as well throw some numbers out while we're talking about this. A mated queen, a queen will go out and mate with, say, 10 to 15 drones. And there's some evidence that it would be better if our queens mated with 20 drones. Each drone can supply about 8 million sperm, I think that's right. I have to look at my notes. Yeah, 6 to 8 million sperm per drone. So if she mates with 10 drones, that's about 87 million sperm she has collected in her mating flight. And these sperm will be in the reproductive tract, so the vagina and up past the little spermatheca where she collects these sperm. And the sperm are then, as the queen comes home from a mating flight, and she has all these millions of sperm, 87 million sperm inside her reproductive tract. The workers take care of her, they keep her warm, they feed her, they groom her, they kind of massage her. And the sperm begin to migrate into the little spermatheca. And they do this in a way we don't really understand yet, but they do this in a way that they become pretty thoroughly mixed so that all of those 10 drones are pretty well represented at any one point in the life cycle of the colony. And she will take up into the spermatheca of those 87 million somewhere between 5.3 and 5.7 million sperm. Okay? So you can put the zeros behind that. She will lay probably a maximum of about 200,000 eggs each season. So when I do the math on that, unless I'm missing a zero somewhere, I figure she has enough semen to become a queen for 20 years. I don't know. Maybe I can't divide anymore, but I keep coming up with that number. But she only lives for about 5. And so I'm not sure what a poorly mated queen is, but she probably has enough semen, and it may be she didn't get to mate with enough drones. And if you've ever heard Dr. Delaney talk, she's in Delaware, and she did a lot of work on how many drones our mated queens average in the United States, and it's like 5. And why is this important? Well, drones bring the diversity that we see in our colonies, and that diversity allows a colony to function. It makes sure that there's enough worker bees with the genetics to do housekeeping and brood feeding and wax making and pollen collecting and water collecting and all the things that have to be done in a colony. And if she only mates with 5 drones, some of these jobs may go missing, and that's really bad for a colony. So really important that your queens are well mated. All right, back to score sheets. This is the second score sheet that Sue will look at. And these are the list of breeder queens she has selected to make a score of. She knows who the mother queen is. Okay, so the mother of the breeder queen. And so then with the score sheet, she's going to have, let's see, what have I got here? This is a weight gain. So she's taken a scale and lifted the colony with the scale hooked under the bottom board so that she can weigh the front, and she weighs the back, so that's why you see front and back here. And she gives a total weight gain in percent. And what weight gain tells her in the spring and in the fall is how well that colony is. What is its viability? How fast is it going to grow? How well are those bees doing? So she does a weight gain score sheet. And the next one. This is the final colony rank. So you see here's the hygienic test over here. Here's the tracheal mite counts. And this is the preseason selection. So are they gentle? Oh, what else was on there? Are they gentle? What is their buildup? What is the viability of the brood? All those things are, the total scores are in the pre-selection line up here. And so she gets a total score for weight gain, hygienic behavior, tracheal mite, and the pre-screening, pre-screening, and she gives them a number over here, a ranking, and so you can see that anything that scored over 100, actually 90%, anything that scored 90 or above was selected as a breeder queen, and the other ones were dropped out of that selection process. And what she's trying to find is tracheal mite resistance in these bees. So that's what she's looking for. So let me explain what a breeder queen is. So when you first start out raising queens, you try to do this kind of score sheet so you have a record of what your queens were like. And hopefully they're young enough you can follow them for a season or two. And when you get daughters from these queens, you want to look at them and see where they would score in this rank. And if they are also as high as their mother for all these traits, then it shows you that you're selecting for those traits and they have been passed on to the daughters. That takes at least one season, and then you probably have to hold that queen over for another season and graft from her again to see if it still follows through. At that point, you can say she is a breeder queen. Her offspring are showing the traits that you're looking for, and they don't get lost between the mother and the daughter. Does that make sense? Okay. So then you have a very valuable bee. If you go out and look for breeder queens on the market, you will find that they're available. You can find Russian breeder queens and all kinds of queens out there from different yards and different possibilities of people raising queens. If they advertise her as a breeder, they should have some evidence that her daughters are showing the same traits. They can charge somewhere between $300 and $700 per queen. And you're getting a 2 to 3 year old queen, so you have maybe one season to work with that particular queen. So that is a breeder queen. Before that, they're just nice queens, or they may be just general queens on the market. All right, so you can see that your investments get more and more, and you may not ever buy a breeder queen, because who has a breeder queen from Portland, Oregon? Nobody. There's nobody raising queens up here that I know of yet that sells them, so probably no breeder queens to buy, which you're probably going to, because that's expensive, and I've already spent a lot of money on nukes and frames and hive tools, and anyway, so those are score sheets, and I highly recommend them, and maybe 2 or 3 of you want to get together and start raising queens, and so what are some of the other problems you're going to run into? So you now have, I don't know, 20 colonies. How many colonies do you have, Tim, in your breeding program?
Well, we haven't picked what we're going to shoot for 50.
Okay, 50. And that's a good number. That's as far as I could get, because I didn't treat for varroa mites, and I was looking for hygienic behavior, and so I didn't treat for... I would spot treat maybe, or I would just requeen if I found foul brood, which is what hygienic behavior was first developed for. It probably also helps with varroa mite. Where was I going with that? Sometimes I get talking and I forget what I'm saying. The number of colonies. So it's recommended, I believe, in Laidlaw's book that you have 200 colonies if you're really looking at selection. But I never got that far, and I think I was getting somewhere with selection when I was totally wiped out by pesticides on Christmas trees. And that really takes, you put a lot of work into this. You can already see that there's a lot of work that goes into getting a good queen, especially if you're trying to select for something. And so if you get wiped out, you kind of go, what am I doing? All right, there's a number of different techniques, and I bring these up because not everybody can graft. So the first one I want to mention is one that Heike Williams kind of introduced me to. She said, can I put some egg nukes among your bees because you have some selection going on? And I said, sure. I'd never heard of an egg nuke before. What's an egg nuke? Well, what she had done is she had screened some of her queens, and they have 600 colonies, so she's got a better chance of doing some decent selection. And she had pulled frames of eggs from the ones that she wanted to develop queens from, and she put them in 10 nukes, I think. So I had 10 nukes that had a frame of eggs, some capped brood from other colonies with bees, and honey and pollen. It was 4 or 5 frame nukes. And she closed them up and set them in the yard. And we'll talk about how you should set up mating nukes if we get there. So that she wanted these bees to mate. So they had to raise from the egg a queen. And that took about 16 days, right? So she didn't want to look in these colonies because they're queenless. And so they're very nervous, little darlings. So 16 days for a virgin to emerge. And it's going to take about 3 days for that queen to be ready to fly. So she's now 19 days old. She's going to go out on 1 or 2 mating flights. And if she goes out on more than one, it'll be a day or 2 before she's mated. So there's, where are we? 16, 17, 19, 20, 21 days. That's 3 weeks. She's mated. She comes back mated, but she's not ready to lay eggs yet because she's still very young and she needs the eggs to, now that she's mated, begin to develop. So the mating triggers the hormones in her body to say, okay, make eggs. So she begins to develop eggs, and then that takes another 4 days. And you don't want to go into that colony then for 3.5 weeks minimum. You probably want that queen to lay for a few days because she's just getting started. So she may only lay a little patch of eggs the first day. and she may add to that the second day. So you want to give her a few days. So it's at least a month before you even look to see if you've got a virgin queen mated and actually have a queen right unit in that little nuke box. She did really well, but that's a long time. Even if you graft, you must wait. You know, if you graft, you put that egg in, or that larvae, a young larvae, into a cell, and you have all these cells, and you set them in a big, strong colony. We'll talk about that. And they make the queens. So it takes 7 days before they start to cap the cells. And then they're very fragile. They're very, very fragile from the time they're capped until about 10 days when the pupae begins to get a little strength to it. So if you handle your frames, and you know, if you're in a colony and you go, wow, I think this is queenless, and you pick up a frame and flip it, you know how we handle our frames? I'll just borrow this for a minute. So you pull them out, and you want to look at the other side. You flip it like this, right? Is that how you do it? That's how I do it. Mm-hmm. So if you pull this out, and you think you have a queenless colony, and there's a queen cell over here, you know, that would turn this back into a queen right unit if the virgin gets mated, and it's just been capped, and you do this, and you damage that larvae in there, then you've shot yourself in the foot, so to speak, because you can't get that colony queen right now. So I try to train myself when I'm, especially in the spring and they're swarming, not to do this, because I don't want to damage any queen cells if I'm going to lose that colony, and so I try to turn this way, which is really awkward. You used to do it. The wrist flip. Anyway. So before I get to grafting, I just want to mention that there is another technique. So if I could have the next slide. It's called the NICOT method, and it's probably a French word, and I probably bastardized it. It's NICOT. And this is a method that was developed in France or Belgium or one of those French-speaking countries, and they have a plastic comb, which you see at the top, and they cage the queen on it. So you put it in your colony, you let the workers work it over so that it's cleaned out to suit them. You cage the queen on it until she has laid a number of eggs in there. The cage allows the workers to come in and take care of the queen, but it doesn't allow the queen to get out. And you have placed these little cell cups in that unit, and I think there's like 110 spots for the queen to lay. And then if she does lay, you can take those little units out and you can put them in I think this white thing. And so you need all these parts for this unit. I tried it once, and the queen just said, I'm not laying in this plastic stuff. Let me out of here. So I've never tried it again, but some people are very successful with it. So the next slide, I just wanted you to get an idea what the kit comes with, and it's about $300, I think, when you get everything. And then you buy bits and pieces that come by the thousands so that you can use that single 110 slots over and over again. So here are the completed queen cells, and the little black plate that you saw is tacked to a top bar of a frame. And then you can snap the white thing onto the little black plate that's tacked to your top bar. And then you can take that little cup that now has your larvae in it and stick it up into the white holder, and we'll hold it there. And then you hang that in your cell builder finisher. And I'm going to tell you what a cell builder finisher are in just a minute. And these are capped cells from that. And so this makes it possible for you to raise queens without grafting. It's just an option. Okay, next slide. So, but a lot of us want to raise queens quickly and easily, and grafting is a method that was developed by a fellow named Dr. Doolittle, back, that's his name. I don't know when he wrote the book, but it's been a while ago. So a lot of queen breeders will take an empty frame and put a date on the top bar and stick it in the middle of the brood nest of the colony from which they want to graft larvae. Okay? And this works for a lot of them. And I could never get it to work, so I finally just said, okay, the queen never lays when I expect her to, so when I go back to look for eggs, it takes weeks, and then my mating nukes are, getting too old, and forget that. I'm not doing that. So I look for a frame that has both eggs. Can you see the eggs up here? There's an egg in this row right here. You get up about 2/3 of the way. There's an egg sitting there. And I use that egg as a comparison to the young larvae, because you need to graft a larvae that is less than 3 days old, and preferably not more than a day old. If you graft a larvae that is 3 days or older, you are likely to just get a worker, or that larvae may be rejected when you put it into your cell builder. So this is the grafting tool I use. These are about $12 a piece, and I'm going to pass this around the room and hope I get it back. It's got a little spatula at one end that you can mix up stuff with, and the other end, this one with all the bends in it, is the end that you slip under your larvae. And you look for larvae that are about the same size as that egg. And there's a few on here, and you look for ones that the bees have fed, because when they first molt into a little tiny larvae, there's no food. They've been an egg, and the workers haven't had to feed the egg, so they have to come by and find that larvae and give it royal jelly, or a substance like royal jelly that they feed all the larvae for the first 3 or 4 days. And if you can slip, so you want to find a tiny larvae with quite a bit of royal jelly, and it's clear at this point. It looks like water. And you slip the end of your grafting tool under the back of the C. This little larvae is lying right there like a little C. And if there's enough royal jelly in there, you can just slip this grafting tool. It's called a needle. It doesn't look like a needle at all. There are probably 10 different types of grafting tools out there. This is the one I always used, and I started using it way back when I took stuff from Dr. Burgett, and I was still a graduate student, and I found it pretty easy to use, but you might find something that's better for you if you can find some variation. But I like this one, so you can see what it looks like. It's a very hard implement. It's not soft or gentle or anything. And you try to get enough royal jelly on the tool as you slide it under that larvae that the larvae doesn't get bumped or damaged by the tool. And then you're going to put this on a bar. In the cell cup of some type. And I don't find I get any better advantage if I hang this in a colony and let them clean and do whatever it is they do to the cells before I put a larvae in. It didn't seem to make any difference. So I set it up like this, and then I do what's called a wet graft. You can also try doing dry grafts. But a wet graft is a lot easier, and it's less likely you will damage the larvae with the wet graft. So what is a wet graft? Well, you have to have a source of royal jelly. And what I do usually early in the season, they're almost ready to get ready to swarm, and I will graft 10 or 15 cells and hang them in there, and if they accept those cells and will rear a queen in there, they will fill it with royal jelly for me. If I use these cells, it would be maybe, maybe not. They turn into a queen that's mated because the weather is still pretty iffy. And so then I take these cells when they're about 4 to 6 days old, and I just freeze them right as they look here. Except there's royal jelly and a little tiny larvae in there. I freeze them, and then I can use that royal jelly, and I'll take one of these out of the freezer at a time, and I usually wrap them individually with something, saran wrap or something to keep them. And I put them in a glass jar, and I pull one out at a time, and it would do, I think, somewhere between 15 and 25 cells for me. You just want a tiny little drop. I mix a little water with it so that it will work in a narrow dropper, and I put a tiny little drop in the bottom of each of these, and then I graft the larvae into them. So I also am a person who likes to use what the bees use. These are plastic, and they have the advantage that when you go to pull them off the frame, you've got something solid to pull on, and less of a chance of damaging the queen cell that you just spent hours and hours and days and sweated over. So that's kind of an advantage. I do know how to make wax cells, and I really like wax cells. I think the queens like them better, and I would get better take if I used all wax cells. So if you get into queen rearing and decide you want to learn how to do this, I'd be happy to come up and do a workshop. You'll notice that some of these wax cells, these have been in a colony, and they said, we're not raising any queens for you, so I just took them out. But they're on a little piece of wood, and they're glued to the wood with wax. And then we glued them to a bar like this one with wax and set them in the colony. So I'll send these around. And you're going to take these larvae, or these bars that you've grafted the larvae in, and stick them into a frame of some kind. Now you can build your own out of a frame. You can build your own bar holders. But I like these because they're narrow, and if I have an 8-frame, I use 8-frame colonies. If I have an 8-frame cell builder, I can slide these in as a 9th frame and get away with it. Or it can be a 7th frame with a division board feeder, because it always helps to have a nectar flow. And Oregon can be difficult as far as nectar flows go, so sometimes you may want to, I feed every colony that I hang these in for the first 3 days anyway, because if there's a nectar flow, they're more likely to accept your larvae. Also, I use that same technique when I'm putting queens into colonies, because that helps too. If they're fed and happy, they're more likely to accept the new queen. Just no. So this was made for me by a fellow, some of you may know him, Ken O'Green, and it's really quite beautiful. My son made me a slightly simpler model. I don't think he nailed these, and I finally had to nail them or they were going to fall apart, but you can see they're a little loose. Or this might have been one I made myself anyway. Narrow board. A lot of bar holders have 3 places, and I almost never use all 3. And I almost never ask a cell builder to build me more than 20 cells or 25 cells. Because you get bigger and better queens the fewer you ask, but some people will put 30 to 60 cells in a cell builder depending on how big it is. So we'll pass those around. And we could have the next slide. So cell builders. This is a favorite subject of mine. I think I've tried every cell builder there has been in the book. And I used Laidlaw, and he'll give you a recipe. 1 frame of honey, 1 frame of pollen, 1 frame of brood. Make sure it's cat brood and do this and da-da-da-da-da right through the whole thing. And I could never do that. It never worked for me because I'm probably too hyper. So, am I going over time?
We're getting close.
Okay.
I didn't know if you wanted to compress the...
I'll try. We won't get to the end. Cell builders are critical to raising good queens. They need to be strong. They need to have a lot of young bees, but they also need to have a balance of older bees. And they need food, and they need a feeder of some kind. And it was really frustrating for me because by the time I finished raising a set of cells, I had to redo my cell builders every time. And I usually ended up using my cell builders to make a few mating nukes for me because, quite frankly, with 50 colonies, it's hard to make mating nukes. And I don't know if we'll get to mating nukes or not, but it is hard. Mating nukes are the limiting factor for all your queen rearing. And I remember one year I was having really good success, and I kept asking my colonies for more mating nukes. When I got to the end of July, I realized I had taken so many bees from those colonies they could not put up honey. And I was madly trying to feed these bees to get through winter because I just kept taking bees from them so I could keep my mating nukes going. So it takes a lot of bees to make mating nukes. But let's go back to cell builders. Cell builders, so I didn't like the queenless one high body cell builders because I couldn't keep them going. And then I read about cloak boards, which is basically a queen excluder with a slide-in excluder, so you can start out when you put the slide in, you have a queenless unit on top and a queen right unit down below, but they're separated by the excluder, so your top is queenless. You put your cells in there. When they're accepted, you slide the slide out, and then you have a queenlet right finisher, but the queen can't get up and destroy your cells. Okay? And I began to think about this because sliding that thing in and out, I'd always go, shoot, I should have slid that out, and I should put it back in. It's a little tricky. And I never had the patience for that. And I realized, why do bees build queen cells? When do they do it? They do it when they want to swarm. So if I can keep a colony strong enough to swarm, they will raise queens. So I did a double deep, and I put a queen excluder between the deeps, and I put the queen down. It gave me 19 frames to look through every time I reset the cell builder, the cell builder. It was always queen right. I moved young brood up because the young bees will follow the young brood, so I tried to always find 2 frames of young brood. I moved honey down because the bees will move honey up, and that makes them think they have a flow on. And I also had a feeder, which I'd feed them maybe a quart of syrup every time for the first 3 days. Okay, and I used those as my cell builders. And I would use them right through to my final graft sometime in August, and they would always accept the larvae. So I threw out the cloak boards, and I just used a queen excluder on a strong colony, and I worked really hard to keep that colony strong and queen right. And those were my cell builders. But there are a lot of different cell builders out there. Next. When you set out your mating nukes, you don't want to set them all in a line. And we've already talked about them being the limiting factor, so this is not one of my yards. But you see they're set in a circle, and they all face at different directions, because your virgins go out on a mating flight, they may get lost coming home. If you have them sitting on a two-colony stand, especially if that stand has an older colony on it, they might go in the wrong colony and kill the queen you've got in there, so you may lose one of your drone mothers or whatever. So you want a mating yard that either, I've seen them set out along creek banks so that there's a lot of visual differences from each locality, or they're set in circles so the queen can find her own colony when she comes back from mating. What have we got left? Cell builders. Oh, these next few slides, we'll just go through them really quickly. This is bulk bees. You see these big cages? There's about 100 pounds of bulk bees in each of those cages. The next slide shows the bulk bees. You see the can back there? So they scoop the bees into the can, weigh them on a scale, and dump them into the nuke for you. It's a horrendous nightmare. There's bees everywhere. They don't always stay in the nukes, especially if you've missed a tiny little hole that's down on the bottom board somewhere, and they'll crawl out and hang everywhere. And wow, this is what we do to our bees to make package bees and mating nukes. And if you buy bulk bees, if you go to California and your bees build up, you can buy bulk bees from other beekeepers and bring them home with you to make mating nukes. It's lovely. No wonder our bees are stressed. Next slide. Mated queens. What do you do with mated queens? Next slide. You can use your nukes as a plug-in unit to requeen with, and Marla Spivak recommends this. Again, remember when your colony is queenless, they're very nervous. So if you have a laying queen and you can set her right in there, they'll usually accept her right away. Otherwise, if you're going to ship queens or you're going to maintain queens, this is a queen cage holder that I made. It's nothing too fancy. I used it for these wire cages, which I prefer if I'm having to store my newly mated queens anywhere, would be in a wire cage. I use these wire cages for virgins too, and I would hang them between combs. There's a lot of space for bees to take care of a queen through these cages. And I can put them in the nuke in which the inseminated queen is going to be first introduced as a live queen. So it works pretty well. You can pass those around. There are all kinds of queen cages. These are just examples of a few. This one was kind of invented by the guy who runs Snow Peak Apiaries. This was a prototype. They filled it with propolis, bless their hearts, but it has large holes, and I like that because the workers can feed the queen and take care of her when she's in a cage with holes that are large enough. But he reduced the hole size when he went into production of these, so I wouldn't recommend them now. But a large hole size, because he made it too small, and workers can't take care of the queens while they don't work. Yeah, but this slips right into the top bar. You know, there's a groove in the top bar to accept your wax foundation, and this will snap in there, at least the first few times you use that top bar. And you'll find the same thing with these cells that you snap in. After a while, you broaden that little space, and the cells will fall out. Watch out for that if you use plastic cells snapped. And this is a 3-hole Benton cage. And I want you to imagine you're a newly mated queen. You're maybe 4 days into laying or less, depending on the queen breeder and how fast he's trying to kick these out. I have a feeling Kona Queens kicks them out before they're even mated, but I didn't say that. I don't know what they call this, but you often see these in a package of bees, a 2 or 3 pound package, and they hang in on a little aluminum strip. So you're a freshly mated queen bee, and along comes this monster thing, and he grabs you out of your little colony that you've just been accepted into, and he throws you into this tiny little space with hardly anywhere for the workers to come and groom you and feed you and take away your shit. And we put these in a mailing container of some kind, and we throw them in the truck. And they're bounced around, and they're jiggled, and they're not fed, and they're not watered. Usually we put some attendant bees in there that'll chew on the candy and feed the queen a little bit. I think, why do these queens even lay when they get to their destination? Never mind all the stuff we do to them. We try and introduce them to a new big colony. So I'm going to quit there because I'm probably out of time. That's really a whirlwind trip through raising queens, and I've left out a lot of things I'd like to say. If I could just hit the last couple of slides. Here's an artist. If you can't make money raising queens, maybe you can do some art for them. Thank you for listening to me. Can I just have the last slide? This is a tree hive, and I've decided that I need to look at a different way of keeping bees and go back and find out what we took away from the bees when we introduced them to the champagne boxes back in the 1850s. I am going to work with a group in Portland area and take them, because they're a non-profit organization, and she's looking for ways to have some bees in her garden, and this is Wisdom of the Elders Foundation. I may need some help, so if there's any young, energetic beekeepers who would like to climb ladders and help me keep track of bees in Portland that are in tree hives, let me know. And I have a lot of flyers on Wisdom of the Elders if you're interested in that, and I also have some brochures of tree hive bees, which I can leave with you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everybody. I know this was, for many of you, probably completely overwhelming, but for me, and I know a handful of others in here, it was extremely interesting, and I think is probably the answer to a lot of the problems in the dead-outs that we're having in the winter bees. So we've got to do something. We're going to take a little break here, so if you want to get a snack and whatever, we're also going to do the raffle right now, Mike, I believe. So if you want to take, do you put your name tag in a hat or?
Or let me do it during the question and answer. I'll collect the badges.
Okay, so actually at the Q&A. So we're just going to take maybe a 5-minute break, everybody, if they need to use the restrooms, get some more popcorn, get some water, whatever. Just regroup in 5 minutes.